A few years back, my buddy Chris and I embarked on an epic cross-country road trip. Our plan was to drive from Boston to San Francisco, zigzagging through different states for about 6 weeks. We were both in our mid-20s, pretty low on cash, and since my mom had been a long-haul trucker, I suggested a way to save money: sleeping in the back of our small SUV. It turned out to be a snug but manageable setup. We picked up some blankets and sheets from a thrift store and used one to make makeshift curtains. By the end of the first week, we had our routine down to a science. Within 10 minutes, we could shift our luggage to the front, put up the curtains, roll out the bedding, and be ready for the night. We parked anywhere that felt safe and somewhat legal: rest stops, free campgrounds, parking lots. After that first night, we never felt uneasy until our final week in Arizona. We were near Flagstaff, and by this point, our routine was second nature. We had no set schedule, never drove more than 3 or 4 hours a day, and didn't have a strict itinerary aside from a few must-see spots. We used Google to find interesting places and took recommendations from locals, fellow travelers, and people we met along the way. We had also gotten pretty good at making friends. We grabbed late-night pancakes with some guys we met at a campground, hung out with an elderly cowboy who took us dancing at a honky-tonk, played guitar with musicians in the middle of a storm, and got treated to meals by kind-hearted campers who invited us into their sites. Even on the 4th of July, a family welcomed us into their celebrations. Nearly every stranger we met turned out to be friendly. That night seemed like it would be no different. We found a free campsite through Google and followed our GPS into the woods. It was a bit out of the way, and something about it felt slightly off when we arrived. There was an RV parked nearby and 2 cars further into the trees. We pulled up near the RV, and a man stepped out. Chris gave him a wave, but he just stood there, staring blankly. Then, without acknowledging us, he slowly shut his door while keeping his eyes locked on us. Figuring he just wanted privacy, we drove a little further down the road and found a level spot to park. Instead of setting up camp right away like usual, we spent some time messing around, laughing, taking silly photos, and relaxing. Chris noticed a campfire down the way and suggested we go say hi. After all, we had met so many great people by simply introducing ourselves. So we wandered over with a couple of beers in hand. At the fire were 2 men, the owners of the cars we had seen earlier. They seemed friendly, so we sat down with them. They were drinking and smoking, and we joined in for a bit. One of them, an older guy, was definitely on something. He was spinning in circles and rambling about UFOs, but he seemed harmless. The other guy, who was younger and claimed to be a former park ranger, was much more put together. He was easygoing and good-looking, and we talked for hours about our trip, families, and random topics. Then the conversation took a turn. The ranger started talking about a bear he had seen earlier in the forest. Chris was skeptical, so he pulled out his camera to show her. The photos showed a bear uncomfortably close to the campsite. We were a little unsettled. After all, one of us usually got up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom. The idea of a bear lurking around was unsettling. The ranger just laughed, but then his demeanor changed. His voice became cold as he said, "If you step out of your car at night, it's not the bear you need to worry about." I waited for the punchline, assuming he was just messing with us, but it never came. I forced a laugh and made a dumb joke about horror movies. Chris joined in, bringing up some slasher film, trying to lighten the mood. We moved on to another topic, but within minutes, the ranger brought it up again, this time talking about things that could grab us from our car in the night. No matter how we tried to change the subject, he kept bringing it back to something sinister in the woods. The older guy, meanwhile, was lost in his own world, gazing at the sky. The rest of us just sat there awkwardly, sipping our beers. Then, the ranger stood up and walked toward the cooler to grab another drink. By now, it was pitch black outside the glow of the fire. The cooler was beyond the fire's light, so he was mostly in the shadows. That's when I saw a red dot in the dark. Took a moment to register. It was a camera. He was taking a picture of us. I could see the glow of the digital screen as he checked the image. It wasn't unusual for people to want photos with us. Chris was stunning, dark-haired, blue-eyed, movie star gorgeous, and we were friendly with everyone. But this was different. He hadn't asked, hadn't even acknowledged he was doing it. We just sat there, frozen. Then he adjusted the settings and took another picture, this time with the flash. Still without a word, no request for a group photo, no explanation. He walked back to the fire and sat down as if nothing had happened. Not a single word about the photos. At that point, Chris and I had had enough. We made up an excuse about needing to set up camp and got ready to leave. The UFO guy gave us a friendly farewell, but the ranger just smiled. A cold, eerie smile that never reached his eyes, and said, "Be careful out there. There's more than bears in the woods." Every hair on my body stood on end. Chris let out an awkward laugh and grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the car. We hurried back, only managing to find it in the dark by looking for the RV. As soon as we were inside, Chris was breathing heavily. "Why did he take pictures of us?" she asked, her voice shaking. I was trembling too. "I read once that some killers warn their victims first." She stared at me, then immediately locked the doors. "You think he just took victim photos of us?" We were both panicked. She turned the headlights on, but I freaked out, yelling for her to turn them off. Now he knew exactly where our car was. That night, for some reason, we had never set up camp, so we had nothing to pack up. Without hesitation, she threw the car into drive, and we sped down the dirt road. As we neared the exit, I saw him. The ranger was walking toward our car, still wearing that same eerie expression. This story involves my father, and I only recently heard about it for the first time. It came up when my dad was searching for a tent he had loaned me a couple of years back. I had to admit it had been destroyed during a drunken night by the river, though that's a whole different story. Anyway, back when my dad was 17 in the summer of 1982, he and my Uncle Kevin were adventurous and always looking for ways to keep busy. When my dad finished school that year, he wanted to go on one last big adventure before starting work. He decided to hike the Highland Trail, a 250-mile-long route that stretches from northern Scotland down to central England. Depending on the direction you take, it can take about 3 to 4 weeks to complete. With a long summer ahead, my dad, 16-year-old Uncle Kevin, and their friend Greg were dropped off in Scotland by my grandfather to begin the journey. The first week went great. They met friendly locals, some of whom even cooked meals for them and let them stay indoors for the night. They mainly camped in open fields, but one evening, they decided to push an extra 5 miles to reach a small town where they could stock up on food and replace some broken tent pegs. Around 6 p.m., they arrived in a village and noticed that the local tavern had just opened. After settling in with a few drinks, my dad suspected the owner knew they were underage but was probably happy for the business. The owner eventually offered to let them set up camp in the pub's backfield. However, his wife seemed strangely uneasy about it. She pulled him aside, and they had a brief, whispered conversation. Despite her hesitation, hospitality won out, and after a night of heavy drinking with the locals, my dad and his friends headed to their tent. Inside, they used an oil lantern, which they hung from the tent center before turning in for the night. This small detail would become significant later. At some point, my dad woke up and switched the lantern back on while debating whether to step outside. That's when he heard a door creak open and shut. There were no footsteps at first, so he assumed it was just the wind moving an old shed door. But moments later, he distinctly heard footsteps in the grass, growing louder until they stopped right outside the tent. Thinking it might be the pub owner checking on them, my dad reached for the tent zipper, only for it to be suddenly pulled open from the outside. Standing there was the pub owner, but something about him was off. He wasn't wearing a shirt, only slippers and loose night pants. When my dad asked what he was doing, the man stammered out an excuse about hearing an animal growl and wanting to check on them. But my dad knew there had been no growl, just the sound of the door, the footsteps, and the zipper. The man then oddly emphasized the importance of getting a good night's sleep, reached in, and tapped the oil lantern, insisting it be turned off. Then, with a frustrated sigh, he turned and walked away, heading back toward the pub. The next morning, the owner's wife made them breakfast as they packed up. The owner, however, was nowhere to be seen. He had apparently taken down their tent for them, loaded it up, and left early in his truck without coming back inside. The boys thanked the wife and asked her to pass along their thanks to her husband. She nodded but seemed puzzled, saying she'd thank him when she figured out where he'd gone, as he hadn't been home since sunrise. Later that day, after another long hike, they arrived at their designated campsite near a small stream, about an hour and a half earlier than expected. Since they had already walked nearly 140 miles over the past 9 days, they decided to take a longer rest. When they pulled out their tent, they noticed it was covered in tiny holes, each about the size of a pen's width. Confused, my dad tried to rationalize it. Maybe an animal had returned in the night, just like the pub owner had mentioned? Greg suggested they walk back 2 miles to the previous village to see if they could find a new tent. Leaving the damaged one behind as a marker for their spot, they made their way back. To their luck, they found a small shop catering to hikers, but it didn't have any tents. Instead, they bought tape to temporarily patch the holes for the night and planned to find a new tent further down the trail. By the time they returned to the site, night had fallen, and only the moonlight guided them. But as they approached, they froze. Their tent had been set up again, but it was on fire. Flames engulfed the entire structure. They rushed to put it out, using their water bottles and refilling them from the nearby stream until the fire was finally extinguished. When they examined the remains, they discovered that their oil lantern had been smashed inside the tent, likely causing the fire. Someone had followed them, set up their tent, and waited for their return before breaking the lantern and setting everything ablaze. My dad says there's only one person who could have done it, the pub owner. He must have realized my dad was awake the night before and abandoned whatever he had planned. Instead, he took some sick form of revenge by sending a message. At first, I didn't believe my dad's story, thinking he was just trying to scare me. But when I casually mentioned the burned tent incident to my Uncle Kevin over the phone, he immediately started rambling about how bizarre it was. And my Uncle Kevin never lies. The answer to what I witnessed that evening remains uncertain. It was definitely at ease climbing trees. Even now, whenever I walk through the woods, I glance up, half expecting to catch another glimpse. I've searched for years, on and off, but still haven't found any creature that fully matches what I saw. This might not be the most terrifying tale, but it's certainly one of the strangest experiences I've ever had. It happened in the Adirondacks back in the summer of 2021. I had just finished my studies at university and wanted to do something exciting before settling into my new job, something adventurous. So, I planned a solo backpacking trip for a week in those mountains. I had spent much of my childhood exploring the outdoors, so I was confident in my hiking and camping abilities. Being alone in the wilderness didn't worry me. The first few days of the journey were incredible. The weather was ideal, warm and bright but not overly hot. Each day, I covered around 8 to 10 miles, soaking in the breathtaking landscape. I passed by a few other hikers along the way, exchanging greetings, but for the most part, I had the vastness of nature to myself. On the third day, however, something felt off. The usual chatter of birds and rustling of small creatures faded into an unnatural silence. The few hikers I did see didn't return my waves or smiles. Their faces were tense, and they seemed eager to leave. I convinced myself it was just because I was venturing deeper into the backcountry, but the unease lingered. That night, I camped beside a slow-moving stream. The air remained warm, so I let my tent flaps stay open to enjoy the fresh breeze. As I started drifting off to sleep, I heard faint footsteps and the crunching of leaves just outside my tent. Sitting up, I listened closely, but after a few moments, all I could hear were the ordinary sounds of the forest at night. Even so, it took me a long time to finally fall asleep. The next morning, I resumed my hike, making my way out of the valley. The landscape grew rockier, the trees denser. As I walked, an unsettling sensation crept over me, the distinct feeling of being watched. Yet, whenever I glanced over my shoulder, there was nothing. I told myself it was just nerves from being alone for days. That evening, I set up camp on a ridge that provided a stunning view of the distant peaks. After cooking my meal and tidying up, I settled inside my tent. The full moon cast eerie shapes through the fabric, playing tricks on my tired eyes. Despite my exhaustion, sleep did not come easily. Sometime deep in the night, I woke with a start. My tent shook violently, the poles bending inward as if something large was trying to crush it. Panic surged through me. I was certain a bear was attacking. I scrambled out, ready to defend myself, but as I emerged into the moonlit clearing, there was nothing. The tent poles were twisted and mangled, yet the fabric was perfectly intact. The night air was still. A profound, eerie silence surrounded me. Rattled but seeing no immediate danger, I did my best to fix the tent and tried to get some rest, though sleep evaded me. By dawn, I was eager to leave. The once warm weather had turned chilly overnight, and thick storm clouds loomed overhead. Thunder rumbled as I quickened my pace, hoping to reach the next shelter before the storm broke. Just as I spotted the wooden structure through the trees, the sky opened up. I sprinted the last stretch and ducked inside, relieved. That relief quickly turned to unease. The shelter wasn't how I'd expected it to be. Dark handprints smeared the walls, and deep claw marks ran along the wooden beams. The dirt floor was littered with ragged, filthy clothing. A foul stench lingered in the air. The fire pit contained charred bones, the acrid scent of burnt flesh still clinging to the damp air. My chest tightened. The wind howled, bending the trees. Then, from the shadows between the trunks, I saw it. A towering, hunched figure moving toward me. I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran, plunging straight into the storm. Rain lashed at my face. Thunder boomed overhead. I stumbled along the slick, muddy path, my heart hammering. I could hear it behind me, crashing through the undergrowth. It was closing in. Lightning struck nearby, illuminating the clearing ahead. I dashed toward it just as a deafening crack split the air behind me. The ground trembled. I turned, breath hitching, but the woods had gone silent once more. The wind had stilled. Rain dripped from the branches. The presence that had been chasing me had vanished. Drenched and shaking, I searched for shelter. A shallow cave nestled among the rocks provided some reprieve. I huddled inside, pulling my knees to my chest, my breaths coming in ragged gasps. The storm raged on outside. Eventually, the rain lessened, and I forced myself to move. Night was fast approaching, and I needed to find a safe place to camp. Every shadow, every rustling leaf sent a jolt of fear through me. I felt it again, that undeniable sensation of being watched. Quickened my pace. As I rounded a bend in the trail, I slammed into something solid, but it wasn't a tree. Staggering back, I lifted my gaze. Pale, hollow eyes stared down at me. A twisted grin spread across its monstrous face, jagged fangs protruding from its gaping mouth. Its breath was rancid. The creature reached for me with gnarled fingers, its claws sinking into my skin. I tried to scream, but my voice failed me. Darkness swallowed my vision. When I came to, I was alone. The night was deep, and the path stretched empty before me. My skin throbbed where the thing had touched me, but there were no wounds. Only the lingering chill of its breath remained. I forced myself to my feet, grabbed my gear, and staggered down the mountain. Every twig snap behind me sent fresh terror through my veins. I didn't stop. I ran. Finally, through the thinning trees, I spotted the parking lot. My car. Safety. With one last burst of energy, I half stumbled, half slid down the final stretch of the trail. Throwing my pack into the car, I jumped into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and peeled away from the mountain. Even over the sound of the engine, I heard it, an inhuman wail echoing through the darkened forest. Who or what made that sound, I still don't know. I didn't stop driving until I reached home, and I haven't gone back since. Until I pulled into my driveway, I left all my belongings in the car and rushed inside, collapsing onto the couch just as the first rays of sunlight crept over the horizon. To this day, I still don't know what I encountered out there, but I swear I'll never set foot in those woods again. Something sinister lurks there, waiting for its next unsuspecting victim who dares to tread that path alone. #### a wrong turn. I was 18 years old when this happened. The full moon hung high in the night sky, casting an eerie glow over the thick forest as I hiked through with my friends, Jake and Ben. At first, it was a beautiful autumn evening, but as the last light of day disappeared beyond the horizon, an unsettling tension filled the air. The deeper we went, the more the shadows stretched and the woods seemed to come alive with an unexplainable presence. Sensing my friend's unease, I tried to lighten the mood. "Come on, guys, don't be scared. It's just a little darkness and maybe a few howling animals. What's the worst that could happen?" Jake, the most daring among us, had been the one to suggest this nighttime hike, promising it would be an adventure we'd never forget. Now, as the shadows deepened and the forest felt suffocating, even I was beginning to question if this had been a good idea. Emma, who had been quiet since we entered the woods, finally spoke up. "David, I have a bad feeling about this. It's way too quiet, and I've heard stories about strange things happening here during a full moon." I had heard those stories too. Reports of missing animals, eerie silhouettes spotted between the trees, whispers of creatures that shouldn't exist. I had always dismissed them as myths, but now, as an icy shiver crawled up my spine, I wasn't so sure. Jake scoffed and draped an arm over Emma's shoulder. "It's just your mind playing tricks on you. Besides, David's got us covered, right?" He grinned, trying to reassure her. I forced a smile despite my nerves. "Yeah, don't worry, Emma. Nothing's gonna happen." We trudged forward in silence, the crunch of fallen leaves beneath our boots the only sound breaking the stillness. The occasional hoot of an owl reminded us that at least some normal wildlife was still present. The moonlight filtered through the branches, creating eerie patterns on the forest floor. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. As we walked, we stumbled upon an old, overgrown path we had never seen before, almost entirely hidden behind dense thickets and fallen branches. Jake's eyes sparkled with curiosity. "Guys, check this out," he said, pointing at the concealed trail. "This might be a shortcut back to the car. Let's take it." Emma and I exchanged nervous glances, but we followed as Jake began hacking away at the tangled brush with his pocket knife. Every step forward sent a ripple of unease through me, a feeling that we were intruding where we didn't belong. The deeper we ventured, the denser the forest became. It was as if the trees were closing in on us, swallowing the moon and stars in their thick canopy. The air grew colder, and a damp, musky scent lingered, making my stomach churn. "Jake, are you sure about this?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake hesitated before answering. "We've come this far. Might as well see where it leads. It has to go somewhere, right?" We continued forward, our footsteps muffled by thick layers of dead leaves. The darkness was suffocating. My unease grew heavier, pressing down on me like an unseen force. Then I saw it, deep, jagged claw marks on the trees. "Guys, look at this," I murmured, pointing at the gouges in the bark. Jake examined them closely. "That doesn't look like an animal, did it?" A shiver ran through me. "We should turn back. Now." Before anyone could reply, a guttural growl rumbled from the darkness beyond the trail. The sound was deep, unnatural. Our blood turned to ice as we froze in place. "What was that?" Emma whispered, her face pale. "I don't know," I admitted, my throat dry. "But we need to go. Now." Jake crept toward the source of the noise, peering through the trees. "I don't see anything," he whispered. But whatever that was, it sounded close. Without waiting, we hurried back the way we had come. The growling grew louder, closer, more aggressive. The sound vibrated through my bones. Then, suddenly, the underbrush exploded as a massive shadow lunged toward us. It was huge, its matted fur bristling, glowing eyes filled with an unnatural fury. My breath caught in my throat as my mind desperately tried to rationalize what I was seeing. But the only thought that came to me was werewolf. Jake shouted, "Run!" We bolted down the trail as fast as we could, the monstrous figure crashing through the forest behind us. Its heavy footsteps shook the earth, its ragged breathing sending chills down my spine. No matter how fast we ran, it felt like the beast was closing in. I risked a glance over my shoulder. The creature's long snout curled into a snarl, glistening fangs bared as it locked its gaze onto mine. A sickening realization hit me. It was choosing me as its target. Panic fueled my legs as I pushed harder, adrenaline surging through my veins. The moment we burst onto the main trail, a piercing howl erupted behind us. We didn't stop running until we reached the car. Panting and shaking, we collapsed inside, slamming the doors shut. Then, something unexpected happened. We started laughing. A wild, nervous laughter born from the sheer relief of survival. As we drove away from the forest, the memory of those glowing yellow eyes burned into my mind. The stories I had once dismissed as superstition suddenly felt terrifyingly real. We never spoke of that night to anyone, fearing that no one would believe us. But the three of us knew the truth. And now, for the first time, I've decided to share it. I still wonder about that creature. Why did it let us go? And why does it haunt my dreams to this day? And before we dive in, I'd love to read your most chilling camping and hiking experiences on the show. So, send them to me at darktales.org and check out eeriecast.com for more of my narrated horror stories. Now, toss another log on the fire because the night is still young. Warning: the following story contains descriptions of violence involving animals. #### something in the trees. From Wandering Pines. This particular event happened when I was in my late teens, so it's been over a decade now. I grew up in the northern woods, spending much of my childhood and teenage years camping and exploring the outdoors. For 2 consecutive summers, I was part of a volunteer group that traveled rural roads and picked up litter. Most of the work involved cleaning up roadsides, but occasionally, we were asked by park rangers to clear trash from trails or secluded roads where people illegally dumped their junk. On this particular day, our group had to divide up into sections. We were given handheld GPS devices, though back then, they were only accurate within about 100 yards if you were lucky. That didn't bother me. I had always dreamed of becoming a park ranger or wilderness guide. Some of the others, however, were uneasy and chose to stay closer to the main roads. That left me getting dropped off at the end of a remote service road, where I would walk back to the designated pickup spot. Each of us had a roll of garbage bags and a grabber tool to collect the trash. The area I was assigned was a known dumping ground. People abandoned old furniture, couches, chairs, and sometimes mattresses. However, a truck had already come through to haul away the bigger items, leaving behind mostly cans, bottles, plastic bags, and scraps of paper. Unfortunately, sometimes we'd come across more disturbing things. Pets that had been abandoned or worse. That day, I stumbled upon a litter of puppies that had been left in a cruel manner. I didn't have a radio, but even if I had, the supervisors tried to prevent us from seeing things like this. Sadly, it wasn't the first time I had encountered such a sight. I decided to bury them rather than leave them among the rest of the garbage. I placed my backpack and grabber tool near the road and walked deeper into the woods, carrying only the bag. After about 20 minutes of walking, I found a large pine tree that seemed like a peaceful resting place. I set the bag down at the base of the tree and started looking around for something to dig with. Eventually, I found a thick branch and broke it in half. Using my pocket knife, I sharpened one end into a makeshift digging tool. The ground was tough, filled with roots, so it took a while, but I managed to carve out a hole about 1.5 feet deep. I placed the remains inside without the bag. I didn't want to add more litter to the forest. Taking a moment to collect myself, I even shed a few tears before offering a silent farewell. As I was finishing up, I heard a small branch snap about 50 feet away to my left. The tree I was crouched under blocked my view, so I froze and listened. The forest wasn't eerily silent. Birds were still making noise, but they had shifted to a different part of the woods, away from where the sound had come from. I hadn't noticed the change at first. I stayed still for several minutes, scanning the area. When I saw nothing, I resumed my task. After placing a few pine cones and a smooth stone over the burial site, I stood up to leave. That's when I heard it. a low, rumbling sound that was somewhere between a moan and a growl. This was bear country, and there were also a few mountain lions in the area, so my first thought was that a predator had caught the scent and come to investigate. I only had my pocket knife, which wasn't much for self-defense, but I wasn't panicked yet. I figured it could be nothing more than trees rubbing together in the wind, a common sound in the forest. I scanned the area again, but still saw nothing, until something fell from a tree about 30 yards away. A chunk of bark and a small branch had dropped to the ground. Looking up, I spotted something partway up the tree. It blended in so well with the bark that I almost missed it. It was brownish-gray with hints of green and had no distinct shape at first glance. It was about the size of a young bear cub, but it wasn't a bear. My heart started racing. I took a step back, keeping my eyes locked on it. As it moved, it became clear that it wasn't part of the tree. It was a living thing, but it didn't have fur, nor did it have normal skin. Its surface looked like moss, shifting slightly as it clung to the bark. I couldn't make out a face until it turned toward me. When it did, I realized with horror that it had one, but it was distorted. I couldn't see eyes, only shadowy features. I was about 80 feet away, and with the dim forest lighting, I couldn't get a clear look. The creature had 4 limbs, each wrapped around the tree trunk. Its paws looked like those of a raccoon, but its claws were unusually long, almost as long as its fingers. It also had a long, rat-like tail that twitched every so often. It climbed down slowly, never taking its focus off me. That's when I noticed something even more unsettling. It had ears. Not animal ears, but round ones set on the sides of its head, more like a human's. It made no noise except for the faint scraping of claws against the bark. When it reached a thick branch about 12 feet off the ground, it crawled onto it. The way it moved was eerily similar to a raccoon, but the shape of its body was all wrong, too rounded, with no distinct neck. Then it made a sound, a low, airy whistle. That was enough for me. I glanced over my shoulder to make sure my path was clear, then turned and ran. I checked behind me multiple times, but it didn't follow. I never saw it again, but to this day, I have no idea what I encountered. When I reported it to the ranger supervising us, he shrugged it off, saying it was likely a raccoon with a skin condition. When I insisted that the face didn't resemble any raccoon I had ever seen, he dismissed it as a trick of the light. The closest thing I can compare its face to is a snub-nosed monkey, but the proportions were all wrong. Plus, there are no known monkey species in this part of the world, and it certainly wasn't an escaped pet. To this day, I still wonder what it was. Ethan was especially quiet on the drive back. He's 19 now, but he hasn't been camping since that day. To be honest, it took me years before I felt comfortable being out in the woods again. What once seemed peaceful now feels full of unseen dangers lurking just beyond sight. Who knows what or who could show up outside my tent next time. Because of what happened, I try not to go hiking alone anymore. Just thinking about it sends a chill through me. I can't stop wondering how close I came to something truly dangerous that day. Back then, I was dating a guy named David. We had been together for about half a year, and we both enjoyed outdoor activities. Hiking, kayaking, and exploring new trails. One Saturday, we decided to visit a new nature reserve neither of us had been to, about an hour outside of town. We got a late start that morning and didn't reach the park until almost noon. The weather was beautiful. We stopped at the visitor center to grab a trail map, and a park ranger highlighted a 6-mile loop that would take us to a scenic waterfall overlook. David and I laced up our boots, strapped on our hydration packs, and set off down the trail. At first, it was wide and well-marked, gently sloping upward as we walked. After about 45 minutes, we reached a fork that wasn't on the map. We weren't sure which way to go. After some debate, David suggested we head left since we could hear running water from that direction, assuming it was the waterfall. As we continued, the trail grew narrower and less maintained. The brush thickened, closing in around us. After another 20 minutes, I started feeling uneasy. I told David I thought we had taken a wrong turn, but he just laughed. "It's probably just a little farther," he said. Maybe it's something even better than the waterfall. Then the forest became denser. We pushed through the tangled branches, and when I stepped into a small clearing, I suddenly realized David was gone. I called his name, but he didn't answer. My stomach twisted. He had been right next to me moments ago. How could he have disappeared so fast? I backtracked, growing more panicked with every step when there was no sign of him. How could he just vanish? Ahead, the trail split again, but neither path looked familiar. My heart pounded as I called his name again. Silence. I picked a direction at random, desperate to find the main trail again. But the farther I walked, the less recognizable everything became. That's when the fear truly set in. I was lost, and I was alone. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows through the trees. I quickened my pace, hoping to find a marker or some familiar landmark. Every unfamiliar turn only deepened my dread. The deeper the woods got, the more eerie sounds surrounded me. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps crunching behind me, but when I stopped to listen, they went silent. Thirsty, exhausted, and overwhelmed, I sank onto a fallen log, resting my head in my hands. Where was I? How far had I wandered? Just then, a twig snapped nearby. My head jerked up, and my breath caught in my throat. A figure stood among the trees about 100 feet back. Tall, motionless. David, I called, but the second I said it, I knew it wasn't him. This person was too tall, their outline unfamiliar. And why weren't they responding? Panic surged through me. I grabbed the nearest thick branch and held it tight, shouting, "Stay back!" The figure didn't move. He just stood there, blending into the shadows, watching me. I had no idea who he was or what he wanted, but I wasn't about to wait and find out. Gripping my makeshift weapon, I took off running. Every few yards, I glanced back, but he had disappeared. I ran until my lungs burned, finally stumbling into another small clearing. My whole body trembled with exhaustion. I couldn't keep wandering aimlessly, not as night closed in. I forced myself to breathe, trying to come up with a plan. Should I keep searching for the trail? Stay put and make a shelter? I had no idea where I was, or if that man was still following me. But one thing was certain. I had to get out of these woods. Then I heard it. Faint but unmistakable, the sound of cars on a highway. If I could follow the noise, it might lead me to a road, to people, to safety. I took a deep breath and started moving toward the sound, hoping I wasn't imagining it. Every snap of a twig sent my heart racing. Was that man still trailing me? What did he want? The forest grew darker, the sounds around me turning more unsettling. Birds screeching, unseen creatures rustling in the undergrowth, the creak of branches shifting in the wind. Then, just as the traffic noise became clearer, something stepped from behind a tree, blocking my path. A tall figure stood just 30 feet ahead. I screamed. It was him, the same man from before. But now I could see his face in the fading light. My stomach twisted in horror. His features were grotesquely disfigured. His skin scarred and twisted as if burned, one eye clouded over, his hair stringy and unkempt. His remaining eye, sharp and alert, locked onto mine. A slow, twisted grin spread across his damaged face. Then, in a raspy voice, he spoke. "Why the rush?" he asked. "Stay a while." Every instinct in me screamed to run. As he took a step closer, I gripped my branch tighter. Should I fight? Try to escape? I didn't wait to decide. I swung the branch with all my strength. He dodged, then lunged toward me. I turned and ran for my life. Branches slapped against my skin as I tore through the underbrush. Behind me, I heard him crashing through the forest, his breath heavy, his voice gurgling with rage. He was gaining on me. Then, suddenly, I burst through the trees into an open space. Parking lot, a road, cars, people. Relief crashed over me like a wave. I sprinted toward a family packing their car, gasping out a desperate plea for help. The father and teenage son scanned the trees, then hurried me into their SUV, locking the doors. The son dialed 911 while the mother handed me water, trying to calm my shaking hands. By the time police arrived, There was no trace of the man. They took me to the station, where they figured out I had wandered nearly 8 miles from the main trail. Park rangers later found David back in the parking lot. He had gotten lost, too, and was just as panicked when we were finally reunited. He apologized over and over for insisting we keep going down the wrong trail. But even after all that, nothing could erase the image burned into my memory. That man's face. Was he just some unhinged stranger lurking in the woods? Or had my own terror twisted reality into something far worse? I'll never know, and I never want to find out. The ordeal still lingers in my mind, especially when I'm home alone for long stretches. Whatever eerie force I encountered in those woods, I know deep inside that it's still out there, lurking. I've never dared to step past my backyard since that night. Sometimes, I still hear distant, bone-chilling cries echoing through the trees, and I can only hope it never finds me again. ####the camping trip, a man in the dark. Camping had always been one of my family's favorite pastimes. Getting away from the city, making meals over an open fire, swapping stories beneath the vast night sky. There was nothing better. My wife, Laura, and I took our son, Ethan, camping whenever we could while he was growing up. But ever since that weekend at Silver Pines Park when Ethan was 12, I don't think I'll ever be able to enjoy it the same way again. It was early October, the perfect season to go before the chill set in too harshly. We arrived at one of our usual spots, nestled deep within the park's dense woodlands, late Friday afternoon. Our campsite was in a more secluded part of the grounds, surrounded by towering evergreens. After setting up the tent and getting a fire started, we roasted sausages for dinner. Ethan was particularly excited once night fell, so I told him a few eerie tales about creatures said to roam the forests. He was at that age where the thrill of a spooky story outweighed any real fear. Afterward, we turned in for the night, exhausted from the drive and setup. Sleeping outdoors for the first time in a while always feels deeply restful, the quiet of the wilderness wrapping around you. The next morning, we made pancakes over the fire as the sun warmed the air. As we ate, a park ranger stopped by to check in. He was an older fellow, wiry with a thick mustache. After a bit of friendly conversation, he reminded us to store our food properly, as there had been recent bear activity. We assured him that we always locked our supplies in a secure container whenever we camped. Once the ranger left, we went on a hike. Laura loved birdwatching, so she carried her binoculars and guidebook, eager to identify as many species as possible. We spotted blue jays, finches, and woodpeckers over the next few hours. Ethan grumbled about being bored, but I could tell he was having fun in his own way. Later that afternoon, we relaxed at our campsite, playing cards and reading. As the sun dipped lower, I noticed a man at the site across from us. He kept glancing our way, his stares growing more frequent as the evening progressed. He looked to be in his late 40s, rugged and unshaven, with a beer in one hand and a cigarette in the other. He occasionally prodded at his fire, but there was something about him that unsettled me. The way he watched us felt off. Not wanting to take any chances, I ushered Ethan into the tent as darkness fully set in. Laura and I remained by the fire until nearly midnight, chatting and stargazing, before deciding to call it a night. Sometime later, I jolted awake to the sound of crunching leaves and snapping twigs outside our tent. I lay still, straining to listen. Beside me, Laura and Ethan slept soundly. The noise grew closer, deliberate footsteps circling the tent. My pulse pounded in my ears as my mind raced. A wild animal? Or something worse? Moving as silently as possible, I reached for my flashlight. My fingers wrapped around it, and I switched it on, the beam casting a glow around the tent's interior. Nothing inside, but outside, the steps continued, shifting around us. Taking a deep breath, I slowly unzipped the tent flap just enough to peek out. I expected to come face to face with some wandering animal, but instead, the light illuminated a human figure squatting just a few feet away. It was the man from the other campsite. His back was to me at first, but the moment my flashlight hit him, he whipped around. Our eyes locked, His were wild and glassy, his expression unreadable. Then, without warning, he lunged. I scrambled backward, shouting for Laura and Ethan to get out. The man clawed at the tent's entrance, forcing his way inside. Laura reacted instantly, grabbing Ethan and shoving past me. I kicked at the intruder, my foot connecting with his face. He let out a guttural sound of pain but didn't stop. With a desperate move, I ripped at the tent flap, forcing my way out. Laura and Ethan were already sprinting toward the main camp area. I snatched my car keys and a pocket knife, slicing through the fabric of the tent as the man pushed his way out. Blood dripped from his mouth where I had kicked him. He lunged again, but I dodged, then bolted after my family. I yelled for help, and within moments, other campers emerged from their tents. I shouted that someone had attacked us and pointed toward the direction the man had fled. He was already vanishing into the dense tree line beyond our ruined tent. Camp staff called 911 while checking to make sure we were okay. The police arrived shortly after, gathering our statements and searching the area. But the man was gone, disappearing into the night. We decided against staying another night and instead found a nearby motel. Sleep was impossible. Laura and I were both rattled. The sense of safety we had always felt while camping now shattered. Ethan barely spoke the next morning as we packed up and left. I haven't been back to the woods since. Could it not leave the path? Was it alone? Perhaps it was doomed to wander the forest beneath the full moon. I shudder at the thought that it might have belonged to a larger group. I may never uncover the truth, but one thing is certain. I won't be stepping foot in those woods again, especially when the moon is full. The trek to my grandparents' place from Pine Hollow, growing up in the remote countryside of Wyoming, I spent much of my childhood outdoors, exploring the forests and ravines surrounding my family's vast property. By the time I turned 12, I knew every trail and landmark like the back of my hand. That familiarity gave me confidence, too much confidence. Looking back, I realized I was far too comfortable being out there alone. I truly believed nothing could harm me. I was so wrong. It all began during the summer before 7th grade. With school out, I had an endless stretch of unsupervised time while my parents were at work. I quickly grew restless just hanging around the house. My grandparents lived about a mile away through the woods, so I started hiking over there in the afternoons, partly for a change of scenery, partly to raid their kitchen. At first, the walks were uneventful. Their house sat right against the tree line, so I'd step from the woods straight into their backyard. My grandmother would always greet me warmly, bustling to prepare a snack while I lounged in front of the TV. It became a comfortable routine. The journey to and from their house was peaceful, just me and the quiet of nature. But by late June, something felt wrong. The usual chirping of birds and rustling of squirrels had faded. The woods felt darker somehow, like a storm was looming even when the skies were clear. I dismissed it, thinking it was just my imagination or shifting summer weather patterns. I should have listened to that instinct and turned back. I was halfway to my grandparents' house when the first raindrops hit. I pulled up my hood and pressed forward. Then, a deep rumble of thunder rolled through the trees, louder and closer than expected. The wind picked up, sending branches whipping and leaves swirling. Though it was mid-afternoon, the sky had darkened into an eerie shade of greenish gray. I hurried my pace, hoping to reach my grandparents' home before the downpour. But the skies split open, unleashing a torrential rain that instantly drenched me. Mud sucked at my shoes, water dripped down my neck, and I shivered as I trudged forward. Then, a blood-curdling scream echoed through the trees. It was like nothing I had ever heard before. No animal I knew made a sound like that. My feet froze, my breath caught. Peering through the sheets of rain, I scanned the shadows between the trees. A faint, flickering light appeared in the distance, swaying erratically as though someone was walking with it. Had my grandfather come looking for me? I called out, but the wind and rain swallowed my voice. The light bobbed closer. It was too low to belong to my tall grandfather holding a lantern. My stomach clenched. The eerie shriek rang out again, much closer this time. Panic seized me. I took a step back, my body screaming for me to run. The light wove between the trees, advancing steadily. My heart slammed against my ribs. I turned and bolted, sprinting blindly into the deeper, unfamiliar woods. I didn't care that I was running into unknown terrain. I just needed to escape. My soaked clothes caught on branches, thorns raking across my skin. Mud splattered my face as I stumbled forward. A blinding bolt of lightning struck a tree just yards away, the deafening crack making my ears ring. The acrid scent of burning would fill the air, steam hissing as the rain battled the flames. Still, I ran. I tripped, crashing to the ground, the taste of blood and dirt in my mouth. I pushed myself up, gasping for air. The light was closer. It weaved between the trees, an unnatural, pulsing glow. I scrambled to my feet and ran harder than I ever had before. Another lightning strike flashed behind me, the impact sending a shockwave through the air, nearly knocking me off balance. I didn't stop, couldn't. Just as my legs threatened to give out, I burst into a clearing. Against the rocky cliffside, an old miner's cabin stood, its wooden walls weathered and warped. I lunged toward it, shoving open the creaky door and slamming it shut behind me. The cabin plunged into darkness. Shaking, I pressed my back against the wall, every inch of me trembling. My ears rang with the memory of the scream. Outside, the thing wailed, a sound filled with pure rage and sorrow. At some point, exhaustion overtook my terror. I must have passed out on the cabin's dirt floor, because the next thing I remember was waking in pitch-black silence. The storm had quieted to a steady drizzle. The air was still. Whatever had been out there was gone. Dazed, I staggered outside. The moon peeked through the lingering clouds, casting just enough light to guide my way. I moved slowly, arms outstretched, every nerve still on edge. I walked all night, my heart pounding with every rustling branch, every shifting shadow. Somehow, by dawn, I emerged from the trees and stumbled onto my own back porch. Relief crashed over me as I threw open the door, bolted it shut, and collapsed onto the floor. My parents never found out about that night. The experience left me with a deep-seated fear of trails and dense woods, especially when I'm alone. Whatever place I ended up in that night, it still haunts me. It feels like I can never fully wake up from the nightmare, always sensing a sinister presence lurking just behind me in the shadows. A strange encounter from Jake. This took place a few years back on a warm night toward the end of summer. I was 17 years old, riding my 125 cubic centimeters motorcycle through a quiet town. I had gone out for a ride to clear my mind as I was going through a rough patch. The hum of my twin-cylinder engine always had a way of calming me down. For most of the ride, everything was peaceful and uneventful, exactly what I needed. I was heading toward a dead-end road that led to a series of small lakes so I could turn around and make my way back. Halfway down that road, I noticed a person dressed entirely in white walking ahead. Normally, this wouldn't be alarming since people often took strolls along this path. But at nearly midnight, with no flashlight or any visible source of light, and not a single house nearby along the 2-kilometer stretch, it felt unsettling. Out of instinct, I slowed down. Pedestrians can be unpredictable, after all. That turned out to be a big mistake. As I passed them, they suddenly let out the most ear-piercing, rage-filled scream I had ever heard. My heart began to race. Before I could even process what was happening, the figure lunged at me. Panic took over as I desperately tried to shift into the lowest gear possible. I caught a glimpse of them in my mirror while twisting the throttle to full power. Now, for those who don't know, a 125 cubic centimeters isn't very powerful, and the acceleration isn't much faster than a person running. On top of that, I had modified the front sprocket to be larger to save fuel, which slowed my takeoff speed even more. Despite my throttle being fully open, the bike was only approaching 9,000 RPM when I suddenly felt a forceful smack on the back of my motorcycle. Terrified, I over-revved all the way up to 13,000 RPM because I didn't want to shift gears while still within reach of this person. They managed to keep up with me until I reached about 30 kilometers per hour. Only then did I start to pull away from them. I refused to slow down. Even after I lost sight of them, a new wave of fear hit me. I had reached the dead end, and the only way forward was into the woods. Panic surged through me, but then I remembered a small gravel path meant for hiking. My bike was old enough to have a manual light switch, unlike newer models where the lights always stay on when the engine is running. Without thinking, I switched them off and shifted into fifth gear to move as quietly as possible. I followed the gravel trail until I reached a main road, speeding the entire way while constantly looking over my shoulder. Even when I got back on the regular road, I kept pushing my speed, unwilling to stop until I was safely home. When I finally arrived, I was shaking, drenched in sweat. I pulled into the garage, storing my bike while anxiously scanning my surroundings. My heart pounded as I rushed to my door, slamming it shut behind me and locking it immediately, just in case. The next day, I called a friend and told him what had happened. Together, we hiked through the woods beside the road, searching for footprints or signs that someone had been there. I suspected it might have been some ridiculous prank, but we found nothing, just our own tracks. We searched both sides of the forest along the entire stretch of road, but there was no trace of another person. I don't get scared easily. I'm a fairly big guy, about 6 feet 2 inches with an athletic build, but that scream? I had never heard anything like it. Just remembering it sends chills down my spine. It didn't sound human. I've shared this story with 3 of my closest friends, and they believed me because they know I don't get spooked easily, nor am I one to make up stories. This was, without a doubt, the most terrifying experience I've ever had while riding at night. Looking back, maybe I could have defended myself. I was wearing full protective motorcycle gear, but at that moment, my instincts screamed at me to run. That horrifying sound alone was enough to make my blood run cold. I haven't set foot on that road since, and I have no plans to return. I still have no explanation for what I saw that night, why that person was there, alone with no light in the middle of nowhere, dressed in all white. There aren't any mental institutions in the area, so I doubt it was an escapee. But honestly, I can't come up with any rational reason for what happened. Thank you for stopping by our little gathering at Campfire Chills to hear this story. If you have a tale of your own to share, send it to us for narration at shadowystories.com. For more eerie experiences, check out my other podcasts, Unexplained Sightings and Tales from the Dusk, available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite streaming platform. You can also visit nightfallnarratives.com for even more bone-chilling stories. Follow me on social media at Dark Echoes for updates, and don't forget to rate and review Campfire Chills on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Until next time, stay safe and watch your back when the night falls. Not long ago, there was a massive breach of personal data affecting about 2.7 billion people. Stolen information, including social security numbers, was taken, which could be used to gain access to financial accounts or even commit identity theft. Now, more than ever, it's crucial to take extra precautions to protect yourself. There's never been a better time to consider using BB's security service. I've been regularly partnered with BB for over a year, and I genuinely believe in their service. BB offers constant monitoring of your private data, quickly handling any threats that arise while also preventing future risks. Their system is designed to be simple and user-friendly, ensuring you always stay informed about your data security. With their free trial, BB will scan the internet to find and remove your personal information from various places, including scam sites, the dark web, data brokers, and hackers. After that, BB sets up ongoing surveillance of your data, immediately alerting you if any issues arise. When I first signed up, BB found my personal information, including my full name and address, spread across numerous sites. Within minutes, BB wiped all of it. In times like these, with major data leaks and scams occurring regularly, having peace of mind knowing BB is safeguarding your details is invaluable. By visiting bb.com/secure or scanning the QR code, you can access a free 14-day trial to check if your personal data has been compromised, remove it from multiple major platforms, and keep your identity secure. I strongly encourage you to take this opportunity to discover and protect any leaked information. Thanks again to BB for sponsoring this section of today's video. Story 2 by Anonymous. I was out camping in the woods behind my property. I own a fair bit of forested land, so I enjoy heading out for a casual camping trip every once in a while. It's only a short 10 to 15-minute walk from my house to a small clearing I set up for camping. Nothing special about it. No great views or lakes, just a peaceful spot to relax. This happened in mid-autumn, and on this particular day, around 4 p.m., I made my way to the campsite. After arriving, I started setting up my gear when I noticed someone walking through the trees. They were only about 100 yards away, and since this was my property, it struck me as odd. My land is surrounded by neighbors' properties, meaning the only way to get here would be by trespassing. I wasn't angry, just confused as to why and how they ended up there. The person was walking away from my house toward my neighbor's land, so I decided to just ignore it. For the next 3 hours, nothing else happened. I mostly relaxed in my folding chair, listening to the sounds of nature. As the sun dipped below the trees, darkness and fog settled over the woods. I lit my fire pit, adding logs and sticks to keep it going. About an hour into the night, as I tossed another handful of sticks into the flames, I suddenly heard footsteps in the distance. Turning around, I listened closely. It was the sound of someone running at full speed through the forest, but it was pitch dark out there. I followed the sound with my eyes as the figure sprinted past my campsite, deeper into the woods, before fading out of earshot. It was definitely a person based on how they moved, but I had no explanation for why they'd be running through the woods at night. Put me on edge, but they didn't seem to notice me, or if they did, they weren't interested in approaching. I thought about packing up and heading home, but since they had kept running, I figured I was probably safe. Worst case, my house wasn't far. I stayed by the fire for another 2 hours, and aside from that unsettling moment earlier, the night was quiet. Around 10 p.m., I let the fire die down and got into my tent, falling asleep not long after. Of course, my rest didn't last long. I woke up to the sudden sound of footsteps rushing straight toward my tent. My eyes shot open as I sat up, listening as the steps stopped abruptly, only about a foot away from where I lay. My vision adjusted to the darkness, and through the thin fabric of the tent, I saw the shadowy outline of someone shifting from side to side, as if trying to peer inside. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a sharp tearing noise. I turned slightly, just in time to see the fabric of my tent being sliced open. A knife slowly carved a slit through the material, and through it, a pair of eyes locked onto mine. Panicked, without thinking, I leapt out of the tent and ran screaming into the woods. Adrenaline carried me all the way back to my house. I didn't hear anyone chasing me, so it seemed like whoever it was hadn't followed. But when I called the police, I glanced out my back window, and there, standing among the trees, was a dark figure watching my house. By the time officers arrived, whoever it was had disappeared. The next morning, authorities searched the campsite, but no leads turned up. What made it truly terrifying wasn't just that someone was out in the woods, lurking around at night with a knife. It was the fact that they followed me back to my house. They knew where I lived. For the next month, I barely slept, constantly on edge. So far, nothing else has happened. If it does, I'll try to update you. Back in 2015, I lived in a small, secluded town where everyone knew each other. The area was mostly flat, surrounded by thick woods, so there wasn't much to do besides hiking or camping. If you wanted to do anything else, you'd have to drive nearly an hour to the nearest bigger town. My buddy Jake and I used to go camping all the time. One day, he told me that a friend of his had suggested a new spot for us to check out. We figured why not and decided to give it a try. It was only about a 20-minute drive from the edge of town, but there was no designated parking, so we just pulled over on the side of the road. The trail leading in was barely visible, like it hadn't been used in a long time. After hiking for nearly an hour, we reached the campsite. Supposedly, there was a great view of a lake, but we quickly realized we'd been misled. There was no beautiful lake, just a murky, overgrown swamp. Maybe years ago it had been something worth seeing, but now it was just an eerie pool of dark green water. We laughed it off, but then Jake pointed out something on the far side of the swamp. A tent. It was too far to make out any details, but it was just a single tent among the trees. My eyes drifted along the water's edge, and that's when I saw them. Further down from the tent, a person stood watching us. They were completely still, just standing there on the opposite side of the pond. To avoid making things awkward, I gave a quick wave. They didn't react, but we assumed they were the camper who owned the tent. We set up our own tents on a hill away from the water and went about our day. We played some card games and had long conversations, occasionally glancing toward the swamp. Strangely, we never saw the person near their tent. They either weren't there at all or were wandering deeper in the trees. As the sun set, hours passed without a single sighting of them. We gathered some branches for a fire, got it going, and made dinner. We were just sitting back, joking around, when Jake suddenly froze. He jumped up from his chair, eyes locked on something right behind me. I turned around, and there they were. About 20 feet away, standing just outside the fire's glow, was a figure with long, messy black hair. They were dressed in dark clothing, and the shadows made it impossible to tell if they were a man or a woman, or if they were holding anything. "Hey, you okay?" Jake called out. I added, "Do you need something?" They stood there for a moment, then suddenly turned and walked away. I glanced at Jake. We were both on edge, but we just kind of laughed nervously, like, "What the hell was that?" Honestly, this was so long ago that I don't even remember what we convinced ourselves to make sense of it. We assumed it was the same person we had seen earlier, but that's all I recall. Whatever explanation we settled on at the time, it was enough for us to go on with our night without feeling too creeped out. Somehow, we even managed to go to sleep. Thinking back, I have no idea how we weren't more scared. I guess we were just young and too confident. In the middle of the night, I woke up to Jake urgently unzipping my tent and shaking me awake. His breathing was heavy, and his face was pale with fear. As I climbed out, he quickly explained that he had woken up to the sound of someone moving outside his tent. When he unzipped it, he saw the same person from before, standing right next to mine. The moment they saw him, they bolted into the trees. Jake was panicked, and I tried to stay as calm as possible. Our options were to either risk walking back through the narrow trail in complete darkness or stay put until morning. We decided to keep the fire burning and stay awake for the rest of the night. We packed everything up, just in case we had to leave in a hurry. As soon as the sun peeked over the horizon, we got out of there. Later that day, after talking things over, we figured it was best to file a report with the local authorities. If someone was out there acting weird, others should at least be warned. We didn't expect much to come of it, but to our surprise, we got a call back that same day asking us to come in for further questioning. It turned out the tent we had seen belonged to a missing person, someone who had been gone for over a month. Authorities had searched the area but didn't find any new clues. They showed us pictures of the missing individual, and both Jake and I were certain it wasn't the person we saw. That realization was deeply unsettling. Whoever we encountered that night likely had something to do with that person's disappearance. And had Jake not woken up when he did, I might have been the next one to go missing. This happened about 3 years ago, right at the start of December. Where I live, the cold doesn't really settle in until the end of the month, and snow usually doesn't show up until early January. I go camping pretty regularly and always try to fit in as many trips as possible before winter hits, since I won't get another chance for months. I took some time off work for the first weekend of December so I could go on one last trip. I picked a spot about an hour north of where I live. I knew it would be a bit colder up there, but I didn't think it would make much of a difference. Besides, I had all my cold weather camping gear, so I felt prepared. I set out early in the morning and reached the trailhead a couple of hours after sunrise. There were 2 other vehicles parked there, a standard-looking minivan and a truck that was covered in mud and scratches, like it had been off-roading. I parked my car and started down the trail. It was chilly, so I put on my jacket and hat. Not too far in, I passed an older man and a young boy who looked like they had camped overnight. That explained one of the vehicles. When I got to the campsite, I expected to see at least one other camper, but the place was empty, just a flat grassy area beside a small flowing pond, with no tents or people in sight. I set my tent up near the trees. For a while, I sat and wrote in my journal, but as the day went on, the temperature kept dropping. I decided to build a fire to keep warm. Not long after that, someone else appeared on the trail. It was a man, maybe in his 40s, dressed in a thick coat with a cloth wrapped around his face. He carried a small backpack, but I noticed it looked almost empty, flat, like it barely held anything. He walked past me, heading to the other side of the campsite, then sat down against a tree. At first, I assumed he was waiting for someone else to show up, but time passed, probably around 45 minutes, and no one else arrived. The man didn't move either. He just sat there, staring at the pond. I wasn't sure whether to feel bad for him or creeped out. Then, out of nowhere, he stood up and started walking toward me. He stopped on the other side of the fire and sat down, flashing a grin across the flames. "Hope you don't mind if I warm up by your fire. It's colder than I expected." I told him it was fine, trying to be polite even though I felt uneasy. There was something off about his smile. His tired, droopy eyes didn't match it, making it seem forced. "You got a tent?" I asked. "It's supposed to get even colder tonight." He shook his head but didn't look worried at all. He just kept that same unsettling smile. For the next 10 minutes, we sat in silence. By then, I had already decided I wanted to leave, but I was nervous about packing up in front of him. The sun was almost gone, so if I was going to leave, I needed to do it soon. I got up and walked to my tent, rolling up my sleeping bag. The whole time, I could feel his eyes on me. When I turned around, he was still staring, still smiling. Then he stood up. He kept looking at me as he slowly walked back toward the tree he had been sitting by earlier. But instead of stopping, he continued past it, disappearing into the woods. I froze, listening. Nothing. The forest was dead silent. I had no idea what his plan was, but I was certain he would be coming back. I rushed to pack up the rest of my gear, moving as fast as I could. Within 2 minutes, I was back on the trail, heading toward my car. I left the fire burning. If he was watching from a distance, maybe he'd think I was still there. The 2-hour hike back in the freezing dark was terrifying. I kept expecting to hear footsteps rushing up behind me, but I made it to my car without incident. When I got to the parking lot, I noticed the old truck was gone. If that wasn't his, I had no clue how he got there. If I had stayed that night, something would have happened. That man had a plan. Maybe he had gone into the woods to grab something before returning, or maybe he was hiding, waiting for me to let my guard down. Either way, I'm certain I wouldn't have had a peaceful night. I still think about it sometimes, and it chills me to this day. This is a bit different from the usual stories, but I think it still fits. A while back, I was the creepy one in this situation. Some friends and I planned a camping trip, which was really just an excuse for us to drink for a few days. I had to work during the day, so by the time I arrived around 8:30 p.m., everything was already set up. To catch up, I started drinking heavily. After a few hours, we started running low on firewood, so we decided to have a little contest to see who could gather the most. I wandered off from the group and came across some logs that had been left behind. Back at the site, nobody was around, so I grabbed an axe and started chopping the wood, enjoying myself. Suddenly, a young couple came out of their tent with the most terrified expressions I had ever seen. That's when it hit me. I was at the wrong campsite. From their point of view, it must have been horrifying to see a random guy grinning while swinging an axe around in their campsite. I quickly apologized and got out of there as fast as I could. At the base of the Ardennes foothills, the name Martin is said to originate from an old Celtic word meaning woodland, which makes sense given that nearly the entire region is covered in dense forests and open meadows. Unlike the taller Pyrenees nearby, the terrain here is lower in elevation. The area has a long history of myths and spiritual traditions, likely influenced by the many different cultures that have passed through over the centuries, Celts, Romans, and more. Now, I should mention that this story is more about an unusual and eerie encounter rather than anything outright terrifying or dangerous, at least from my perspective. Growing up, I viewed these hills as a beautiful place to explore, whether camping or hiking. As I got older, I began to notice a deeper spiritual element tied to the region, ranging from the abundance of centuries-old churches and monasteries to more personal and obscure forms of spiritual practice. That's what I want to focus on today. A few years ago, while on bike rides or hikes, I started noticing strange things. Pieces of fabric tied to tree branches, carefully arranged stacks of stones. At first, I didn't think much of it, assuming it was the work of kids playing or some kind of scouting activity. But as I paid more attention, I realized there was something more deliberate behind these displays than I had initially thought. I came across large spiral-shaped rock formations on mountain peaks, stones arranged in intricate patterns connecting trees in circular shapes deep in the woods, and pebbles arranged in symbols that looked like runes or ancient scripts. There were also strange carvings on tree trunks. It was odd, to say the least, and somewhat unsettling because it felt so unfamiliar. Over time, I began to piece together what some of it was. I started noticing remnants of what I now recognize as sweat lodges. I won't pretend to be an expert on these, but they seem to be connected to spiritual and shamanic traditions, possibly influenced by indigenous practices. Eventually, I witnessed a couple of these ceremonies in progress. While cycling, I would spot parked cars with dream catchers, feathers, or beaded ornaments hanging from the rearview mirrors, often in seemingly random, remote locations. Occasionally, I would see fabric strips tied to trees along the roadside and then hear faint sounds coming from deeper within the woods. Curiosity got the better of me, so I decided to investigate. The first time, I came across a group of people constructing a sweat lodge, gathering firewood. It looked like they had set up a simple resting area nearby, where a couple of them would take turns napping, likely to conserve energy for the nighttime ritual. I didn't want to intrude, so I kept my distance, but at one point, I encountered one of them as he was collecting wood. I greeted him in the local language, and he politely returned the gesture. He didn't seem like a native to the area, unlike the others, so I always assumed he might have been their leader or guide. His clothing also stood out, loose-fitting, dark red garments that had an almost ceremonial feel. The second time I came across a similar group in another location, I wasn't sure if they were the same people, but the setup was nearly identical. What unsettled me a little was that there were small children present. For those unfamiliar with sweat lodge rituals, they can be physically intense and even risky for adults, let alone young kids. The process involves building a small hut with a pit inside and another fire pit outside. Large stones are heated over the outdoor fire until they're scorching hot, then moved into the inner pit, where water is poured over them to create thick steam. Participants sit inside, often using tobacco pouches, herbs, and occasionally even mind-altering substances. Even without drugs involved, the sheer heat and humidity can be overwhelming and, in extreme cases, fatal. I could only hope that the children weren't involved in the full ceremony. The following day, I returned out of curiosity and walked around the site. The remains of the structure were still there, along with several intriguing objects. Small pouches of tobacco hanging from the frame, rock formations arranged in unfamiliar patterns, and symbols etched into nearby trees. The most unsettling discovery, however, was a sizable piece of bone, roughly the size of a clenched hand, carefully balanced atop a tree stump. I wouldn't call this experience terrifying, but it was certainly strange and eye-opening. It revealed a side of the region I had never encountered before, one that, to this day, leaves me with more questions than answers. Several years ago, back in March of 2010, if I remember right, I had just finished the winter term during my first attempt at college and was making the most of my spring break. I, along with 3 buddies, wanted to get outside since it was the first truly warm and pleasant day of the year. I live in Western Oregon, and there's a scenic road that follows the edge of Yaquina Bay and Alsea Bay, just south of Newport. It's called Bayshore Drive, and it's a great route to cruise along since it clings to the cliffside for a while and gives an incredible view of the water. Along the way, there are plenty of pull-off spots where people stop to snap pictures or take in the scenery. My friends and I decided to drive up there and pulled into one of these spots with the idea of hiking down toward the shoreline, having some lunch, drinking a couple of beers, and simply enjoying the day. The path we chose led us down to an area right beside a set of train tracks that ran parallel to the coast, much like the highway above. This is an important detail because a lot of drifters and other odd folks frequently used the tracks as a route. In fact, as we sat on some washed-up logs near the shore, we saw several of them pass by. No one interacted with us, and we didn't bother them either, but about half of them were wrapped in layers of clothing, blankets, or even tarps, which wasn't unusual. We stayed there for around an hour before realizing the spot was a lot duller than we had imagined, so we decided to leave and find something more interesting to do. On our way out, we spotted what looked like a much easier path to climb back up instead of the one we had originally taken, so we went for it. That's when our afternoon took a strange turn. Not long after we started up the trail, we all noticed something that was unmistakably a blanket or some kind of fabric wrapped around an object. It was obvious that whatever was underneath had a solid shape, though it wasn't big enough to be a full-grown person. But somehow, we all immediately knew it was a body. Even now, I can vividly remember the words repeating in my head. Asterisk, please don't be a kid. Please don't be a kid. Please don't be a kid. Asterisk. As we got closer, we saw that it wasn't a child, which, to this day, I am incredibly thankful for. But it was still heartbreaking. It was a dog. The poor thing's head was missing, as if it had been cut off just above the collar, which was still fastened around its neck. There wasn't a single drop of blood, and the blanket was strangely clean, as if it had just been taken out of a laundry closet. There was no odor from the body either, so it must not have been there for long. Even stranger, some branches and bushes had been deliberately pulled and arranged to conceal it from the tracks, which were only about 10 or 15 feet away. It was clear that someone had purposely placed the dog's remains there. Someone had killed it and dumped the body near the railroad, and it had happened recently. At that moment, we all looked at each other, made the unspoken decision to get out of there fast, and rushed up the steep incline back to the roadside. We jumped into my friend's SUV and sped away as quickly as possible. Later, we called the sheriff's office to report what we had found, but they seemed to dismiss it as just another stray that had been hit by a train. When we told them that the dog's head was completely missing, they didn't seem too interested. We never heard back from them, so I have no idea if they even checked it out or if they just ignored it. Either way, I've never gone back to that stretch of road since. A few years back, I decided to go hiking alone on various trails along the Blue Ridge Parkway. For some reason, I thought it was totally fine for a woman in her mid-20s to do this by herself. Definitely not the smartest idea. One of the places I'd always wanted to check out was Black Mountain, so I made my way up there. It was a Tuesday, so there weren't many visitors around. The trail to the top is paved, making the walk fairly easy, though it does get pretty steep. At the time, I was a smoker, so I was seriously out of breath by the time I reached the summit. As I stood off to the side, catching my breath, I noticed someone stepping uncomfortably close to me from the corner of my eye. I glanced up and saw a man who looked to be in his late 40s, with greasy, dark brown hair. He said, "Hey, I saw you struggling to get up here. You're breathing really hard. Are you okay?" His sudden approach threw me off, but I answered that I was fine, explaining that I smoked. I chuckled awkwardly to downplay the weirdness of the situation. He just stood there, staring at me. I gave a small nod, hoping he'd take the hint that I was about to move on. I walked over to a viewing podium that pointed out the different cities and mountains in the distance. He followed me. Out of nowhere, he started talking about how he had recently gone through a divorce and was part of a men's group that traveled to different well-known tourist spots. He asked where I was from, and I told him. Then, he started sharing way too many personal details about his divorce. He explained that he suspected his wife of cheating, so one night, he hid in their closet and caught her in bed with a coworker. He muttered something about how both of them paid the price for that night. I was obviously uncomfortable, and I tried to make it clear through my body language, but he kept talking, barely giving me a chance to respond. First, I figured he was just lonely and looking for someone to talk to. But then I realized I hadn't seen anyone else with him. He had mentioned his men's group, but I hadn't noticed anyone fitting that description around. Maybe they had all split up for a while? Either way, I was starting to feel uneasy. I told him I was heading back down to the gift shop. He started following me again. The trail down had several smaller paths that branched off into the woods, but I wasn't interested in exploring them, especially since I was still winded from the climb. I wasn't walking with him, but he was definitely trailing behind. Then, he called out to me loudly, "Hey!" I turned around. He was grinning from ear to ear. His hair somehow looked even greasier than before. "Why don't we take one of these trails?" he said. "I could show you a really good time." I immediately said, "No, thanks," in a firm tone. To my left, I noticed two older women sitting on a bench. They had been watching us. One of them called out to the man, "I think it's time the young lady gets going now." I gave her a small, appreciative smile and a nod before quickly walking down the main path. I passed the gift shop without stopping and headed straight to my car. The man didn't follow me this time. That ended up being my last hike of the day, and I'm grateful that nothing worse happened while I was alone. I definitely don't go on solo trips like that anymore. Summer of '96. I was 10 and easily frightened, so what happened only made my fear of the world worse. My mom and I drove from Lynn, Massachusetts to Maplewood State Park in Vermont for a camping trip. My dad had to work, so he planned to join us the next morning. Everything was going smoothly at the campsite. We pitched our tent, built a fire. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. While there was still daylight, we noticed a scruffy man with greasy hair at the campsite next to ours. He kept running toward a wooden post, leaping onto it, then trying to balance on one foot. He did this over and over again. It was strange, but we assumed he was just some odd loner. My mom joked that maybe he was practicing for the circus. We laughed about it and moved on. Then came nightfall. If not for our campfire, it would have been pitch black. My mom and I were sitting by the flames, roasting marshmallows, when we heard footsteps coming from the neighboring site. Emerging from the trees, the strange man stumbled toward us. In the firelight, he looked pale and disheveled. I could tell my mom was uneasy. She asked him what he wanted. "Hey," he muttered. "I need your help over at my campsite." We waited for him to explain, but he just stood there. My mom asked what kind of help he needed. "I locked my keys in my van," he said. "I need you to come over and help me." Then he looked at me and added, "Don't worry, kid. You can stay here with your fire." A chill ran down my spine. My mom hesitated before saying, "I'm not sure how I can help. Don't you have a spare key?" The man shook his head. "Maybe you have a hanger lying around? That could work." My mom firmly told him she didn't have one, but he wouldn't drop it. "Come on," he insisted. "You must have a hanger around here somewhere, maybe near your tent." My mom's tone hardened. "I don't have one. My husband's coming soon, though. Maybe he can help. He's a strong guy." At that, the man's expression changed. He grumbled, "Yeah, all right," and turned to leave, disappearing into the darkness. But just before he vanished, he called back, "If you find a hanger, bring it over. I'll be here." That night, we barely slept. Every sound outside made my mom tense. Looking back, she must have stayed up the entire night, afraid a knife would slash through our tent at any moment. Morning finally arrived. When we stepped outside, we saw that the man and his van were gone. Later that day, I heard my mom gasp. I ran over and saw her staring at something she'd picked up near our tent. She held it between us, silent. It was a metal hanger,